Welcome to Open Dialogue. In this segment, we're going to be dealing with the war on Syria. I've termed the whole program around the concept of resistance, and I think that the discussion around Yemen made it clear that there is a form of resistance, a resistance axis, which is consciously fighting an oppression in the Middle East, particularly in Yemen. But the same, of course, has existed in Syria. But there was a lot of obfuscation in Syria. I mean, Syria has to have been the subject of possibly the biggest Western media psyops that I've seen, certainly in my lifetime, perhaps the most efficient. With me in the studio, I have Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome to the show. He's editor of First magazine.
Politics First.
Sorry, Politics First magazine, apologies. And also Sayyid Mohammed Razavi, who's our resident analyst on a regular basis. We have a short report on Syria, and after that I'm going to join the discussion with my guests.
The Syrian Arab Army, SAA, and its allies have liberated the settlements of Al-Hara, Nimr, al-Asaj, and the hills of Hara and Ama, as well as some other points in the area north of Daraa city in southern Syria, from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly Jabhat al-Nusra, and the Free Syrian Army, FSA. The town of Nawa has remained one of the key militant defense points in the area east of the Golan Heights. Once it falls, the defense of militant groups will fully collapse. Meanwhile, reports appeared that some FSA units in the area have requested a ceasefire and negotiations with the Syrian-Russian-Iranian alliance to reach a comprehensive reconciliation agreement. According to reports, a moderate part of the militants want to surrender their weapons and to settle their legal status with the Damascus government. However, agreement has not yet been reached. On July the 16th, US President Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin held a face-to-face meeting in the Finnish capital of Helsinki. The situation in Syria was among the topics discussed by the leaders. During a joint press conference after the meeting, Putin said that the key goal is to establish peace in the war-torn country, and that this effort could become an example of successful Russian-US cooperation. He emphasized the need to return displaced people to their homes and to improve the humanitarian situation. In turn, Trump once again showed the key place of Israeli interests in his administration's policy in the Middle East. He said that the US is closely coordinating with Israel and that creating safety for Israel is among the key goals of his country. Regarding the situation in southern Syria, Putin said that following the defeat of the terrorists, the situation in the Golan Heights must be brought into full compliance with the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement between Syria and Israel. The joint press conference showed that the sides may have found at least a partial understanding on the situation in southern Syria and may have set a foothold for reaching a comprehensive agreement on employing a political solution for the crisis in the war-torn country. However, only real steps from the sides can show how close this is to reality. Meanwhile, the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, have resumed their advance on the ISIS-held town of Hajin in the Euphrates Valley. According to pro-Kurdish sources, the SDF has entered the town, capturing some buildings inside it. Clashes are ongoing.
Well, Syria has been a conflict going on and on since, as long as I can remember now. It's well into the 5th or 6th year. But Marcus, your take on Syria, it's a conflict which has a slight difference to the Yemeni one we've discussed, in the sense that Russia and Iran came out openly in support of President Assad, who incidentally was really painted as the worst thing since sliced bread. He's honestly, the Western media's kind of job on him has to have been one of the most efficient in terms of trying to paint him as an absolute butcher. But what's your analysis of Syria today?
Well, after 7 years of bloodshed, I am delighted to say that the Syrian people have prevailed. They are well on the way to achieving an outright victory against Western, Turkish, Saudi, British and Qatari-backed terrorism. The Syrian people, through their enormous suffering and sacrifices, have saved their country. They have saved their secular multicultural state where churches and mosques stand side by side. That is a shining example to the world of multiculturalism in practice, where Muslims in Syria go to churches, Christians in Syria, they go to mosques. That is what you call a wonderful country. And the Syrian people have, as I said, they've paid an enormous sacrifice, but they are going to win. Now, why did the Americans and their regional allies, and of course the British, target Syria? Because it's a game of chess. By overthrowing the Syrian government and replacing it with a pro-Western Wahhabist one, that would end Russian influence and power in the Middle East, because Moscow and Damascus have been close friends and allies for over 60 years. Iran would become extremely weakened in the Middle East. Hezbollah would become eventually a spent force. And of course, Israel would lose one of its key enemies, namely Syria. So that's what this war is all about. And Syria has been flooded with some of the most repulsive, repugnant human beings in human history. These groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the so-called Free Syrian Army, which are all brotherly Wahhabist groups, have committed some of the most atrocious crimes the world has ever known. These people haven't just cut the heads off Orthodox priests, they have sawn the heads off Orthodox priests. And these are the sort of people who the Americans and the British are backing. But let me end on a positive note. Syria, the Syrian people, are on the verge of an outright victory. And anyone in the world who supports the right of governments to pursue independent foreign policies, who oppose American global dominance, and who oppose the perverse, sickening ideology of Wahhabism, should be rejoicing and should be fully supporting the Syrian people. And let's not forget, the Syrian military, the men and women of the Syrian military, are the heart and soul in the fight against Wahhabist terrorism.
Well, very powerful, positive message there that Marcus is giving us, Molana. I'm interested really in how the West manages to go into these countries. They went into Iraq with Saddam Hussein, and they say they went into Syria for the same reasons, virtually, that he was a dictator, killing his people, and that they were the knights in shining armor going in to regime change. It's the same thing they say about Iran. It's the same thing they said about Libya. There's a pattern here, Molana. But why does it seem as though the West gets it so wrong every time in terms of ending up being on the side of the very people they say they're in a war on terror against? I mean, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda again ended up on the side virtually of the Western powers in Syria. How is that happening even?
Well, the West doesn't care about the people in the area. They care about their own benefits and income that they are going to get from the area. And politically, they want to dominate this area, and they are losing control. Therefore, for them, that is more important than anything else. So that's why what they have been planning. I mean, they were the ones who nurtured Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And when they went out of control, I wouldn't say they went out of control. It was deliberate planning to lead them into a different group, and then they changed into ISIS in Iraq, and they were planning similar kind of activities in Syria, which they have not succeeded, and definitely they have a plan for Yemen as well, and I don't think they will succeed there as well with the type of resistance that Yemenis, as Doctor was mentioning, that in these countries, Christian, Jews, Muslims, Sunni, Shia, they're all united. Recently, last month, I went to Chile and had a meeting with the Syrian ambassador there, and she was saying that our countries, I mean, like she was referring to Syria and Middle East, Lebanon and Iran. So these are the countries where the best example of coexisting is there. I mean, Christians, Jews, Muslims have been living next to each other for thousands of years. Why suddenly there's trouble? I mean, these are all outsiders who come and bring trouble to our countries. And she thanked me as a religious scholar who's wearing this kind of uniform, that we were living together, but the Syrian war strengthened our ties by mixing the blood in the war fronts.
Well, interesting that again the resistance axis seems to be emerging quite consistently across these zones, but it seems as though again Western governments, too many of them, are on the wrong side of this. But Donald Trump in the video that we saw earlier, the earlier report we saw, was quite clearly very concerned for one entity in the region, which was Israel. It seemed like southern Syria, especially the triumph that the Syrian army is seeing in the south, is worrying the Americans, not for any other reason now, but for damage limitation, if you like, and the protection of Israel. Is that what's going on now? Is that their objective?
Well, I think Donald Trump owes a great deal to Israeli businessmen for his election victory in 2016, and in particular a gentleman called Sheldon Adelson, because he, largely speaking, bankrolled the Trump campaign. And it was Sheldon Adelson who, something like 25 years ago, perhaps the latter 25 years ago, introduced Donald Trump to Benjamin Netanyahu. So certainly Mr. Trump owes a great deal to Israel. But I think at the same time, he is sincerely a supporter of Israel, as indeed all American presidents are. And I would say this, though, that Barack Obama, who I was bitterly critical of, at least when he left the White House, the Israelis and the Saudis were celebrating. Now, in my opinion, that is a compliment. But yes, Donald Trump is possibly or arguably the most ardent supporter of Israel that America has ever known. And he's already moved, as we know, the American embassy to Jerusalem, which is an illegal and a totally unjust decision, which is only going to create more tension in the region, more hatred in the region. And I would just say to Donald Trump this: if you really are committed to fighting against terrorism, for example, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, then use your influence in Israel to get the Israelis to start attacking the ISIS formations and the Al-Qaeda formations currently occupying Quneitra. Because, of course, the Israeli military do not attack ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I would say to Donald Trump, here's the challenge. If you are committed, prove it. Get the Israelis to bomb ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He's not going to, of course.
Well, in fact, it's quite the contrary, that Israel has been implicated in taking those Al-Qaeda, ISIS operatives and repairing the damage on the soldiers, the injuries.
They treat them in wounded soldiers, they treat wounded terrorists, and then they put them across the border into the Golan to fight against the Syrian army again. They don't deny that either.
Well, I'm going to move on to the north of Syria, because Syria, of course, whilst it's been cleared out of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Jabhat al-Nusra, sort of Wahhabist, Takfirist forces, the Kurds, who have been given a huge amount of American arsenal and weaponry, are collaborating in the north of Syria, and it's not liberated yet. Idlib itself is not liberated. What's your take on Assad's chances of retaking the whole of Syria?
There's no doubt that Assad will take, with the type of resistance that they are presenting. But at the same time, we have witnessed several times that American and their Western allies have so-called claimed that by mistake they have targeted the Syrian army or the resistance fighters who are fighting in the favor of Syria, and they keep on doing the damage to the forces. And I think the recent activities with the excuse of chemical weapons there was only to pull some of the secret forces out of that area. From British and American secret forces were stuck in that area, so they deliberately created a scenario that Syrians have used chemical weapons and forced them to stop the war for a while, and they secretly smuggled out those secret officers who were assisting the ISIS there.
It seems as though the US has given up on the idea of being able to, if you like, overthrow Assad, and Putin has stood strong, the Iranians have stood strong, Hezbollah has stood strong in terms of their support of Assad. It seems as though that is a fait accompli. But what's the end game, do you see, over the next year, 2 years in Syria? Are we going to get some sort of a peace deal eventually?
Well, I think the Americans know their objective to overthrow the Syrian government has failed, and failed miserably. So now they're falling back onto Plan B, and Plan B is to preserve their current foothold in Syria, in the northwest where al-Nusra is and the so-called Free Syrian Army, and also in the northeast where the Kurds are. But I do believe that sooner or later the Americans will be forced out, because northwest Syria, once the Syrian army is fully liberated, Quneitra, then the Syrian army will focus solely on the northwest, and it will be a costly battle. I'm sorry to say, many Syrian soldiers will be lost in that, but they will liberate that region. Then the focus will be on the Kurds. Yes, the Kurds have been receiving help from the Americans, but they've also been receiving help from the Russians and also from the Syrian government, and President Assad has said that. And much of the territory that the Kurds control, it's a tenuous control, because most of it is not inhabited by Kurds. So there's going to be a lot of political negotiations between Damascus and the Kurds, and I do believe it will be resolved, and therefore the Americans will leave. And I just hope that Damascus and the Kurds learn from their mistakes in the summer of 2012, because in the summer of 2012 I was saying on television, I understand that Damascus and the Syrian Kurds, they have disagreements, but you must unite against a lethal enemy. Do not lose control of that border with Turkey. What did the pair of them do? They did not put aside their differences. They kept on bickering, and what happened? The terrorists, the Wahhabist terrorists, with the support of Turkey, they took control of that border in the north. They flooded Syria with terrorists. That's water under the bridge. The Syrian government paid a lesson for that, has learnt from that. The Kurds have learnt from that. So I do believe once Idlib region and the rest of Aleppo region have been liberated, then I think Damascus and the Kurds will sit down and they will come to a compromise. They have to come to a compromise, and the Americans must not have a foothold in that country, because if they have a foothold, what's to say in 5 years or 10 years' time they couldn't try again to try and overthrow the Syrian government?
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, we've come to the Azan break, sadly. I'll pick up on your point that you want to make, but I've been given stern instructions that we've now got to take a break. Join us after this short Azan break.